Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christie.
And I'm Melissa, and this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
dirtbag murderers. Hey listeners.
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
Thank you for joining us today.
We are so excited because we have a listener request.
We do. Our listener named Ivy has requested this case a couple of times, and we're so happy that we can finally bring that to you. Melissa has been working her butt off for you, Ivy, doing so much research for this case.
And we hope you enjoy it.
We do. And thank you so much for being a loyal listener. We know you've been with us for the long haul.
And if there's any other listeners out there that have requests, send them in to us. We'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. But this, I know, is a long case, and some of you have probably heard this before, but we hope that we can do it some justice, and I feel like we should just get right into it.
All right. So today we're going to talk about one of the most infamous family annihilators in American history, which is so appropriate because this week, some parts of Canada will celebrate Family Day. So happy Family Day, everyone.
Hope yours goes a lot better than this. But we did have Melissa do this one because of her fascination with family annihilators.
And this one was a fascinating one to research. And the more I dug, the more interesting it got. There were just so many avenues to explore because with any case that's over 50 years old, it's been told and retold again so many times that some of the facts get misconstrued or misleading details show up. And this was one of those cases where it took a while to investigate and fact check on everything. And when a murderer gets away with a crime for 18 years, despite there being no question about who he was, there's a lot to unpack. So buckle up.
I'm buckled.
From the discovery of the bodies in this case to the unsuspecting monster behind it all, it is the stuff of horror films. The case created fear in the small town of Westfield in 1971 that would spread nationwide and spawn images of a boogeyman that was out to get everyone. Westfield is a town located in Union County, New Jersey, located 26 kilometers or 16 miles southwest of Manhattan. In 1971, it was an upscale suburb of Victorian homes and stately mansions, and it was an idyllic place to live out one's dreams. But on December 7th, those dreams would become nightmares. Based on officers' accounts from that day, it had been a dreary one, with a light rain falling on and off all day. Fog had collected and circled, setting an ominous mood as police made the grisly discovery at 431 Hillside Avenue. The 19-room post-Victorian home, set back 100 yards from the main road, belonged to the List family. John, his wife Helen, and their 3 children, Patricia 16, John Jr. 15, Frederick 13, and Alma List, John's elderly mother that lived in the apartment on the 3rd floor. For a family of 6, the house was extravagant. There was a chef's kitchen, a billiard room, and a ballroom. The house was massive. Its mahogany entryway opened into herringbone patterned oak floors, which led to an expansive staircase straight out of Gone with the Wind.
Oh my.
There was even an intercom because the expanse of the house was just too large to yell for supper.
That's wild. I had a friend growing up who had an intercom in her house, and I was like, whoa, you're rich.
Well, and if that description doesn't give you the idea that this is a grand house, the house had its own name.
Oh, that's when you know it's a bougie house.
That's right. This house was known as Breeze Knoll, and I've been trying to think of what my house's name would be.
I don't think I want to say on air what my house's name would be. Maybe that's what we need to do, though, is name our houses.
Would that make them seem more grand?
Maybe. Something Manor. I think I'd want Manor in mine.
But just because it had a name doesn't mean that it was all that. Because outside appearances can be deceiving, just like the family who lived there. The house was not all it seemed, and told a very different story from the inside. It was scantily furnished and needed some serious TLC. Earlier that evening, around 4:30, police had received a request from 2 concerned citizens, Mrs. Barbara Sheridan and Mr. Edwin Iliano. They were the List's 16-year-old daughter's drama teachers. They were concerned that the family had not been seen or heard from in over 3 weeks and requested that the police investigate. At 7:30 that same evening, police got another call about the residence. And I'm always amazed at the seemingly random coincidences that happen in cases sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
2 people calling in at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's the universe pushing for police to make that discovery.
Mm-hmm. This call was from the list neighbor, Dr. William Cunnick. He was calling about his concern that he hadn't seen Alma for quite some time and was concerned about the lights in the house that were always on, but now seemed to be going out one by one. He also reported that on several occasions, he had seen someone suspicious in a white Pontiac creeping around the house.
So the lights had been left on so long, they were slowly burning out.
Mm-hmm. Police started calling around to friends of the lists, and as they were doing this, they get a second call from the Cunnick home. This time, it's Mrs. Cunnick. And at 9:45, she informs police that the white Pontiac is back, parked in the list's driveway, and that her husband has gone to investigate. 5 minutes later, 2 police officers, Zalesnik and Haller, are dispatched to the residence. The white Pontiac is Mr. Iliano's, and he and Miss Sheridan have decided that they need to find out what's happened to the List family and why no one has heard from them in the 3 weeks. And so they figure that the police aren't doing anything about it. We're going to go and figure this out.
Ooh, they're brave. But thank goodness for concerned neighbors and friends.
Yeah, and I'd like to think that if my whole family were missing for 3 weeks, that somebody would notice at some point.
I'd notice.
Thanks, Christy.
I'd hop in my minivan and go over there to investigate. I'd be like, woman, where are you? We got things to do.
This is a large family of 6. How do you just disappear?
Yeah.
All 6 of you, right?
That's true.
But there was a reason why it had taken people so long to contact the police about the List family disappearance. John had provided an excuse for his family's absences. He had sent messages to the kids' school, their carpools, activities, and their part-time jobs that the family would be away for an undetermined amount of time to care for a sick relative in North Carolina. He had canceled deliveries from the newspapers and the milkman, and even telephoned the neighbors to let them know that his wife's mother was very ill and that the whole family would be away for at least a week or 2. That's why people weren't raising questions about the family that had been missing for almost a month. It was a perfectly good explanation. Unfortunately, it wasn't the truth.
Oh, it seems like he thought of everything, like even canceling the paper so that even just passerbyers wouldn't be concerned about all these papers piling up outside the door.
Yeah, he was really methodical. But it wasn't really until these nagging gut feelings got the better of people and the lights going out one by one that somebody was actually motivated to go and check up on the family. That's when the true reason for their absence was made known. When police arrived that night at the house after listening to the curious reports from the drama teachers and the neighbor, they decided it would be best to enter the house and do some investigating.
So the neighbors that showed up there, the drama teachers, they didn't actually go in. They were just kind of kept scoping it out.
When they showed up, they just kind of waited in the driveway.
Okay.
Almost expecting the police to show up, like a neighbor to notice them and show up. There are some huge discrepancies about what led to the bodies of the List family being found. And I'll go into detail about the one that I found in the police records and the one that held up in court. But there is a very different version of these events told by Mr. Iliano. He claims that he had a very close relationship with Patty. And I'll go over this supposed relationship when we talk in depth about the List family dynamics. But for now, just know that he was suspicious about Patty's disappearance. He tells how he had driven past the house numerous times, looking for any signs about the family's whereabouts, which were corroborated by Dr. Kinnick's versions of events about seeing the white Pontiac several times around the house. But Edwin Iliano claims that on December 5th, he actually snuck into the house and found the bodies on his own.
What?
He said he was so freaked out by this discovery that he froze for like 2 days, not knowing what to do. Then on December 7th, he decided to stage a discovery with witnesses present. Remember, he is the drama coach. It's all about theatrics for him. Staging the scene is why he called the police before and took Miss Sheridan along for the ride and parked in the driveway where he knew neighbors would see him this time.
I wonder if he was worried because he left the scene of the crime, like my DNA might be in there. I need to get back in there.
Yeah, I don't know really what his whole version of events was about.
Very odd behavior either way.
Some believe his story, but I think his actions later in life are questionable enough to take his version of events with a grain of salt. He goes on to make this self-serving movie about Patty's story from his point of view.
What?
He wrote it, he directed it, and he cast himself as a key player in Patty's last 8 months.
What?
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm not buying it then. I think he's doing it just for the attention and his little 5 minutes of fame.
It was a little different. His version of events in this movie did not get great reviews, especially with people who actually knew the daughter, Patty. It sounds like he was just this creepy drama teacher that liked teenage girls.
Oh, creepy.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's a grown man, right? And this is a teenage girl that we're talking about.
Yep.
Ugh.
But I thought it was important to point out that there are these two versions of events of how this played out, because he tells his version to other people.
I don't know. I don't feel like I'm buying it at this point. I think he's just some creepy dirtbag.
It did sound that way to me. But he never did change his version of events throughout his life. So who knows if his story is true or not, but it isn't the one found in police records. From those records, we learn that police entered the home around 10 p.m. through an unlatched window in an open porch on the east side of the home. As they entered, there's this soft classical music playing over the home's intercom system. The house is noticeably cool, and on the first floor, where lights have all burnt out, it's dark, and there's this faint, foul odor.
Oh,
Beyond just entering a scene that would have been from any creepy horror show, the officer's first signs that something is not right here greets them from the butler pantry floor. Dried blood is there. As they investigate deeper into the house, Mrs. Sheridan leads them through the hallway between the kitchen and the ballroom. The entranceway into the ballroom is curtained off. As they enter the ballroom, which is pretty much devoid of furniture, the smell gets more pungent, and they are greeted with 4 dead bodies laying on sleeping bags.
no.
Laying parallel to the interior wall is Helen. Her 46-year-old body was found lying on her back, face to the wall, and a towel over her head. Next to her, laying perpendicular to the same wall, is each of the list children. Closest to the wall is Patricia, or Patty, laying partially on her stomach. Next is Frederick. The 13-year-old is on his side on the same sleeping bag as his sister. It has been opened up completely to make room for both of their bodies. John Jr. is the closest to the center of the room on his sleeping bag, laying on his back. He too has a towel over his head.
So just the mom and son have the towels on their heads.
Mm-hmm. Helen is only dressed in her dressing gown, but all 3 kids have on their coats, and John Jr. actually still has on his winter gloves, and
Ooh.
all of them have been shot. There are some reports that say the bodies were arranged in a cross-like fashion, but after seeing the crime scene photos myself, it was more like a T.
That's what I envision as a T.
Yeah, it didn't look like a cross to me at all.
Right, and his wife would be at the top of the T.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't even imagine how eerie that would have been with classical music playing as you're discovering this.
Yeah, it sounds like a scene from a horror movie.
It really honestly does.
Mm-hmm. And you know that cold, creepy feeling that they try to always convey? The house was cool, it was dark, and then you've got this creepy music. I can't imagine what it was like.
I can't either.
So creepy. As police search the rest of the house, they make one more deadly discovery. On the 3rd floor, Melissa is found lying on her back in a small storage room off of her kitchen. She is neatly dressed, and she too has a towel covering her face. She's been shot as well.
So did he only feel remorseful about his mom, his wife, and his oldest son? Like, why didn't he have a towel over the other kids' faces?
I'm not really sure. And that's never explained.
That's interesting. Because that's usually like a sign of remorse, right? To cover their face like that.
And I would have thought that too, especially because his oldest son was considered to be his favorite son, and he had a very, very close relationship with his mother. So had it been just those 2, I would have thought, yeah, he's showing remorse for them. But because it was on his wife's face, I don't think he was remorseful for her death at all.
Oh, interesting.
And so I don't think that it was just for remorse. Later, we'll go through the actual sequence of how each of the bodies got there. And it's not even the sequence of events that determine which ones got towels on their faces.
Wow.
It's very curious. It was clear, though, that all the bodies had been there for some time.
Oh, at least 3 weeks.
The only member of the family that had not been found was John. The suspicions that were mounting against him were confirmed when police find a letter addressed to his pastor, Reverend Rewinkle. In that letter, handwritten on a crisp yellow lined sheet of paper, John List had claimed to have killed his family and listed justifications why he had done it. But even with a list of reasons written by the murderer, people were shocked and horrified that this quiet man could do such an unthinkable thing to his family members. Veteran police officers and prosecutors that were privy to the crime scene details all could not wrap their head around what kind of man John List could be to commit such an unnatural act.
Oh, that's so true.
They just couldn't understand how this family man could murder his wife of 20 years, his own mother, and his 3 children. It's a father's job to protect, not destroy. What kind of monster could do such a thing?
And that's exactly it. They're a monster to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. As police gathered evidence from the crime scene and talked to the family, friends, and neighbors, a picture started to emerge about the List family's life and the man that seemed incapable of such atrocity. And while searching through the past to figure out the motive, they hoped to find a clue about what had happened to John himself. So who was John List, and what had transpired before that grisly discovery and the murders? John List was born on September 17th, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan, to German-American parents John Frederick List and Alma Maria Barbara Florence List. His parents came from a parallel family tree.
Meaning they were related?
Yup. John's father was his mother's great-uncle.
Great-uncle?
Mm-hmm. At 64, John Frederick List had married Alma, 26 years his junior, when his first wife had died of cancer.
What?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know I have strong feelings about that.
No.
Her great-uncle. Not even just her uncle. Her great-uncle.
Yep. At the time of their marriage, John Frederick already had a grown son who was the same age as Alma.
Oh, that just, my goodness. And did she even really have a voice in the matter? Like, did she have a say in the matter?
It sounds like she did. So Alma was actually now the mother of her first cousin once removed.
That's wild. I think a rule of thumb should be that if you've been in a relationship, you have children, and then you're looking for a new relationship, the person you're going to be in a relationship should be closer to your age than your children's. There, I said it.
Christie has very strong feelings on this. But the two of them had met when Alma was caring for John Frederick's first wife. Both of John's
Wait. So Alma was caring for his ailing wife.
Mm-hmm. As a family member would.
Oh, so this is making more sense to me then. So it wasn't like the family just sacrificed her to this great uncle. They were trying to help by sending their daughter to go help with his dying wife. And they probably had no idea that he was going to then put the moves on her. What a creep.
Or they just fell in love, Christie.
No, he's a creep and he probably manipulated her. That is infuriating to me. She's there to help your dying wife and you're making eyes at her while your wife's on her deathbed. Sorry, I know I'm being judgmental and maybe I'll regret saying all of this later, but come on.
It does seem like quite the story.
I'm hooked on that. That's going to take a minute for my brain to get over this. You don't hit on your dying wife's caretaker.
No?
No. That's a dirtbag move.
It is, especially when it was like only a year later that they were married.
Yeah.
Interestingly, we don't hear a lot from John Frederick's first son about all of this.
Yeah.
Both of John's parents were devout Lutherans, and raised as an only child, John had a very strict religious upbringing. This wasn't something he disliked or complained about. Really, the opposite. He embraced the teachings of his parents wholeheartedly. From John's accounts, there was no abuse or anything that he considered odd about his childhood. Others would point out that Alma was overly domineering and protective of him. Alma often would not allow John to play with other children for fear that he might get injured. His father didn't have much to do with his day-to-day raising. That was all left up to Alma. He did instill into his son, though, a very profound sense of moral obligation and duty. A man's job was to provide for his family financially and lead them spiritually. John's father was a Sunday school teacher and the church treasurer, positions that were regarded with very high esteem by John's mother. And John as a child was expected to live up to his parents' high expectations in his behavior, school performance, and even his appearance. He was expected to emulate his father. These expectations were recalled years later by a tenant who had rented a room in the List's home. Laura Warner said that John was the neatest little boy she had ever saw. While his parents rented out rooms that could have been his, John, for his whole time at home, would sleep on the couch in the parlor.
What?
Each day, he would neatly fold his blankets and belongings and store any of his personal effects away out of sight before heading off to school, neatly dressed and groomed without complaint or even prodding.
Whoa, that is not a usual upbringing for a little boy.
No, but he describes his upbringing as perfectly normal.
Yeah, it's not sounding so normal.
No. What child actually would do that religiously every day?
No, we can't get most kids to put their shoes in the closet.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're saying normal, you know what we're saying, right? Like, but this is very abnormal. We realize that there's lots of different ways to raise your kids, but to have a little boy to be so pristine and
neat and never complain.
Right. Well, it's like he didn't have a childhood.
Yeah.
They were just raising this tiny little adult.
Well, John himself really enjoyed the order. For his time at the Bay City Central High School, John didn't really make any impression at all on any of the students or the teachers. A student that would later date John in college hadn't even remembered that he had been in her classes in high school. That's how much of an impression he made.
Yeah, I can believe it. He's just like an afterthought. You can sleep on the couch, put your things away, go to school.
He just learned to blend in to the scenery. It was firmly taught to him that he should never be seen or heard from. He just needed to be in the background.
And it doesn't sound like he was ever allowed to find out who he really was. Play is important for kids.
Mm-hmm.
Finding out their likes, their dislikes, you know, that kind of stuff. And then he was just taught to be like his dad.
He was taught that order was everything. And as a personality, he never had much of one.
Well, he wasn't allowed to have one.
No.
It sounds like.
John would graduate in 1943, just as World War II was really getting going. Many of John's contemporaries had left school early to enlist, but John's mother would not allow him to do so. It was too dangerous of a place for her one and only precious son. His father had different views on serving, though. He felt that it was his son's duty, and as soon as John graduated, his father's patriotism, deeply cemented in his own heart, allowed John to disobey his mother for one of the few times in his life, and he joined the army. In the army, he served in the infantry as a lab technician during World War II, the perfect meticulous job for John. According to military reports, he saw just under 40 days of combat duty, but was recorded as being a prisoner of war when he was taken at gunpoint by some German soldiers for a brief period of time. And for a brief period of time, it was like a few hours.
Oh, okay.
But during that time, he was held at gunpoint.
And so would he later say that he was traumatized by being held as a prisoner of war?
Yeah, he's going to bring that back up later.
Okay.
Although his description of his combat doesn't match military records.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would think that would be traumatic.
Absolutely, to be held at gunpoint,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how long it is, I think it would be traumatic.
Being robbed at a store and being held at gunpoint for just a couple minutes would be traumatic.
Yeah.
Let alone a couple hours.
And so that does come back into John's defense during his appeals later on.
Okay.
That he did suffer from PTSD.
Okay.
But back at university, he seemed to have no trouble getting on with his life. There, he used his keen sense of numbers and his exacting personality to study business administration and eventually accounting at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He was a numbers fanatic. He loved the columns and neat rows where everything had its place and could be neatly tucked in to where it belonged. University seemed like a pleasant time for John. He was really active in the university's Lutheran Student Association, and he continued military training in the Reserve's Officers Training Corps, earning himself the title of a second lieutenant, which made Alma really proud of him.
Mm-hmm.
He felt some real status by having that lieutenant designation.
It makes sense that he would even go into that kind of job. Just how he was raised, like things need to be order and a place for everything.
Mm-hmm.
Things have to make sense.
That's right. They all have to add up for John.
Mm-hmm.
In his final year, he even joined a fraternity for business majors. This wasn't a frat house for partying, but it was one for social networking. And John made some very good connections that would help him get a very good job at an accounting firm as a junior auditor in Detroit right out of university. The whole time that John was in university, Alma would visit monthly and spend quiet reflection time with him reading the Bible.
Oh, wow.
John's father had passed away a few years earlier when he had been serving in the Second World War, and now it was just him and his mom, and their close bond continued strong into John's adult life. While John's relationship with his father was described as being very standoffish and official, with him barely showing any emotion when his father died, his relationship with Alma was very different. She was warm and affectionate and doting. She was very proud of her son's accomplishments, and he basked in that love and pride.
Which makes it just that much more shocking that he was able to pull the trigger on her.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I say, if it had just been her and his oldest son that had the towels over their head, then I could understand it. But as we get into his relationship with his wife, you're going to see why I don't think that he would feel remorse over her death.
Okay.
As John's finishing up university, the Korean War was intensifying. And in 1950, John had to put his career on hold because he was called back into active duty and was stationed in Fort Eustis in Virginia. There, his ability to strategize and his logistical understanding was put to work arranging transport for military personnel and materials. It was in Virginia that John met his future wife, Helen Morris Taylor, on October 13th, 1951, at a bowling alley.
That's such a wholesome story, right? Like, it's the 50s, you meet at a bowling alley. It's unfortunate that it has such a horrific end.
Yeah, it sounds like the perfect beginning for a loving couple. The reason why Helen was at the bowling alley is that Helen's sister, Jean, had brought her out trying to cheer her up. Helen was recently widowed and had just buried her husband, who had been killed 6 months earlier in Korea. Helen's first husband was regarded as a huge war hero.
Oh, so she's obviously in a vulnerable position right now.
Yeah. Helen, it seemed, did not have the easiest of lives, according to reports made by Jean. She was only 9 months older than John, but she had had a lot more life experience. She was the third of 5 children and had grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina. She was physically abused as a child and had fled home at the tender age of 16 to marry a soldier named Melvin Taylor. During their marriage, Helen went through a series of trials. During the delivery of their first daughter, Brenda, she was splashed with ether in her right eye that caused permanent damage to her vision and altered her appearance because the muscles in her eye were weakened.
Oh, that's terrible.
And when her second child was born, a little boy, she seemed to have escaped catastrophe during delivery just to have him die 6 months later from a blood incompatibility.
Oh.
After that, she had several miscarriages.
Oh my goodness.
But Helen seemed to persevere in her life with Melvin and her only child, Brenda. Despite the fact that he liked to bar hop during his tours of service, Melvin was a hero in Helen's eyes. His death was a shock to Helen, according to her daughter. Brenda said in a 1971 interview that when John met her mom, that she was, quote, in bad shape then, really destroyed over my real dad's death, and she had been seeing a lot of men. I guess she just settled on John.
So how old was the daughter then at that point?
She was 9.
Okay.
So she was old enough to remember these things.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a pretty good summation of John and Helen's courtship, because John was definitely not the type to attract ladies. He was shy and for the most part awkward to the point of almost being endearing. He had no game at all. He actually still retained that totally miserable quality of fading into the background in almost every setting. That's why at first, Helen had actually gone out with his friend.
Oh, wow. And maybe that's why he goes on so long with not being caught, because he's just fading into the background.
Oh, it totally is.
Oh.
He just has this quality of never sticking out.
Mr. Cellophane.
Mr. Cellophane is a really accurate description of John's personality. When Helen's relationship with John's friend didn't work out, she eyed up John as the more respectable option and husband material.
Well, and she probably got to know John a little bit because she was dating his friend.
John was an officer in the Army with a very promising career lined up for him when he got out of the Army. His accounting job had promised him $56.25 a week. Not too shabby, fresh out of school, and was definitely appealing to Helen, who now had a child to support and had frequent health problems of her own. Helen had contracted syphilis, presumably from her first husband.
During his bar hopping days. I was wondering if that bar hopping included any special little ladies.
Yep, it sounds like it did. While in most people, the effects of syphilis stay dormant for some time, Helen was affected almost immediately with hepatitis that required ongoing medical attention and racked up the bills. She would have periods of wellness followed by long periods of fatigue. I couldn't find a dated report of her medical condition early in their marriage to determine if she knew she had syphilis prior to marrying John or not, but I think it's very unlikely. It seems that her condition wasn't fully understood until much later in their marriage, when she suffered some more serious complications of the disease. But whether in the dark on purpose or not, John was reportedly over the moon with Helen's attention, only cooling his excitement for his new romance when Alma showed her displeasure for John's choice in a girlfriend.
So he was totally smitten until Mommy wasn't too thrilled.
That's right.
But it doesn't sound like Alma would have been thrilled about her son dating anybody.
No, and especially not a woman that had already been married.
Even though she was widowed. Like, give her a break.
Yeah, Alma just thought that Helen was not good enough for her son. And I think you're right. I don't think any woman probably would have been good enough for Alma.
Yeah, he definitely falls into that category of having an unusual relationship with his mother.
Yes. But Alma wasn't the only person with misgivings about this relationship. Her sister Jean felt that Helen would need a much more assertive man than John to keep her happy and to keep her spending in check. Jean's husband, who is also named Jean, he later said about John, quote, "He wasn't one of my favorite people. He had feminine tendencies, you see. I considered him a mama's boy. I thought they had a loser from the word go."
Oh, ouch.
Yeah.
But we know he's such a dirtbag, right? So it's like, yeah.
He wasn't impressing anybody, that's for sure.
If your loser radar was going off, you were correct.
Yep.
Maybe not for the reasons you're saying, but we know he's a dirtbag.
Mm-hmm.
And it is really sad that back in that day, like if you had feminine qualities as a man, you were really judged for that.
Mm-hmm. And that judgment came through pretty harsh with his brother-in-law.
Ugh.
Helen wasn't accustomed to being alone, and she felt she really needed a father for Brenda. She wasn't going to be dissuaded by John's mother's less than welcoming attitude or anybody else's. The two were married on December 1st, 1951, after Helen agreed to John's only condition, that she join the Lutheran Church.
That's super quick. Was that only like a month of dating?
Just under 2 months.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And she had dated somebody else in between.
Oh, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like 2 months after meeting that they were married?
Yeah, less than 2 months after meeting.
Wow.
The quick courtship was rumored to be because Helen had tricked John into marriage by saying that she was pregnant.
Huh.
While John was chagrined with his sin of premarital relations, he was determined to do right by Helen when she told him that she was pregnant.
Oh, yeah. He's super religious. What was he doing?
He really felt that now that she was pregnant, it was his duty to marry her.
And it's early 50s. That alone, too, would say that that is your duty.
Mm-hmm. John says that he did later find out that Helen had never been pregnant. But by then, the wheels had been set in motion, and it was too late to call off the wedding.
Why would she want to lock him down so quickly? Like, it's not like he's this incredible catch or he's super rich or like, I wonder why.
It sounded like he put off the vibes that he was going to be responsible enough to financially provide for them.
Huh.
And by Helen's sister's reports, it sounded like Helen liked to spend money. So now you have this woman that likes to spend money, that now doesn't have an income coming in. Brenda had a small settlement from her dad's pension, but that was in Brenda's name. And so it sounded like Helen wanted the security of John's promised job. The job that he had been given at the accounting firm. It was a decent wage.
Right. And she's probably still in mourning. Like her husband's just died. And she's probably flailing. It's early 50s. You have limited options, especially as a single woman, but then also with a child.
Mm-hmm. And she has her own health conditions, so it's not like she can provide for them.
True.
I think she was feeling the pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And John was this guy that seemed respectable. It wasn't like he was going to be like her first husband and step out on her all the time. He wasn't a ladies' man. He wasn't putting off that persona.
Right.
So here you have this super respectful guy. He's got a good paycheck. He seems like a suitable candidate to take care of them.
Right. And less of a risk.
Mm-hmm. So she locks him down by saying, "I'm pregnant."
Gotcha.
So their early marriage did seem to do pretty well. John finished his service after a brief time in California, eventually settling in Detroit to work. The moves necessitated by John's military career didn't seem to faze Helen. She, however, did have a little trouble navigating Alma's new role in their lives because she was used to running her own household for how long? Since she was 16. And now she had this interference of John's mother. Not that she was living with them at the time, but John always wanted to check in with his mother and see his mother. When they moved to California, he had wanted to take his mother with them.
And she's a little domineering.
Mm-hmm. And so there was a little bit of back and forth between Helen and Alma.
Some growing pains to get through there.
That's right.
See, it's a tale as old as time.
Mm-hmm. But they eventually worked out a compromise that John would visit his mother without Helen just to keep the peace because Alma wasn't too welcoming with Helen either. It came from both sides.
Oh.
Brenda recalls happy memories with John, though, as a child. And she says that the two of them were often allies when Helen took her sorrows and bitterness about what had happened to her in her early life out on the both of them.
Mm.
So Brenda remembers happy times with John when it was just them.
So you're right. It does sound like a good start.
Yeah, I mean, they had their difficulties, but they were working things out.
Yeah.
John's accounting career, too, seemed like it was going fairly well. And definitely on paper, it seems like it was taking off at this time. He went through a series of jobs, each paying a little bit more than the last one. But when co-workers and employers were talked about, it seemed that John, on further inspection, was not what he had initially appeared. First impressions were that he was this intelligent, neatly dressed, polite man that had a way with numbers. But after people got to know him, they soon found that he was just not as personable as first thought. When his true colors showed through, he was encouraged to apply for other positions in different companies.
Oh, no.
There was always this kind of glowing recommendation of his accounting skills and no word on his lack of personality.
Because they wanted him to get hired somewhere else.
Yeah, companies were excited to see him exit. And so they would give him these glowing recommendations. He's this wonderful accountant, and not say anything about how socially awkward he was.
They're like, please take him off our hands.
For someone who was described as being a master strategist, John seemed oblivious to all of these personal undertones. He had always been treated as someone special by his mother. So why wouldn't these companies always want him? And of course, he was worth as much as they were paying him. John's sense of prestige was also growing because he was being given positions of authority at church. He was a Sunday school teacher and he was the parish treasurer.
Just like his dad.
That's right. Both of these positions his father had had. He felt like he was checking all the boxes.
Yeah, I finally made it.
Yep. I've done my patriotic duty. I'm doing my family duty. He's doing his religious duty. He's checking all the boxes.
And I'm just like my dad, aka great uncle.
That's right. Christy's still reeling over it.
I still am. Yeah, his dad was his great uncle.
Yep.
Holy moly. Pudding and pie.
Unfortunately, though, for John, his feelings of confidence didn't really carry over to his home life. Helen was increasingly unhappy and despondent. She had had 3 children in quick succession, and it took its toll. The couple's first child, Patricia, was born January 8th, 1955, quickly followed by a brother, John Frederick, on October 21st, 1956. Frederick Michael was born on August 26, 1958, and would be the last addition to the List family.
Ooh, that is quick.
In 3.5 years, she had had 3 children.
Wow. That would not be an easy task for anyone.
Let alone a woman that's already struggling with her health problems. After a period of happiness after each birth, Helen began to be overwhelmed with caring for the couple's 3 young children. And Brenda, who is now a teenager, did not take kindly to her mother using her as a babysitting service.
Oh, you could totally see that would happen.
So it created a lot of tension between Helen and Brenda, and then John and Brenda, and John and Helen.
Yeah, and then meanwhile, all these little kids running around.
Along with her various treatments for her, at the time, mysterious medical condition because she hadn't yet been diagnosed with syphilis, Helen was treated for depression and was seeing a psychiatrist regularly. She was frequently prescribed medication, and that medication, combined with her increasing alcohol consumption, left her lethargic most days.
Oh.
She stopped attending church, and neighbors reported that she left young Frederick in his playpen for hours unattended. And not just in the house, she would park him in the driveway.
What?
And just leave him there.
Well, that's really sad.
It is. But she was ill and she was having difficulty coping, and she turned to drinking scotch more and more to kind of just fade away. John and Brenda were often left caring for the 3 small children. John just couldn't understand, though, why his wife was so unhappy. He was checking all the boxes. They were going to church. He had these prestigious titles at work. He was bringing home the money. And so he couldn't figure out why she wasn't happy with their situation in life. So what he tried to do was buy her happiness, because Helen liked to spend money. And occasionally this would work. So it cemented for John that his wife needed to be provided with her heart's desires. And if he was going to provide for his family, he was going to do it the right way, with the very best of provisions.
Oh, that is a slippery slope.
So John gets this spending mentality.
Oh, no.
Both John and Helen were spenders. As long as John was making a decent wage, this wasn't really a problem. But the two also never learned how to save for a rainy day.
Well, and it sounds like they're using materialistic things as kind of a Band-Aid, and they're not really looking at what's causing this unhappiness or these things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like, I get that your love language can be gifts, but this sounds like an extreme.
In April 1959, Their spending really did become a problem for their lifestyle.
Oh, and that can quickly get out of control.
Because he had these successful careers, but he was kind of just being shuffled company to company. He wasn't actually finding success in them. He was missing the undertones that he was being shuffled because he wasn't well liked. He thought it was because of all of his accounting skills.
Oh, everybody wants me.
And so he was building up this confidence that everybody would always want him.
Not thinking that, ooh, I might run out of companies to get pawned off on.
That's right. In April 1959, when they bought their first home, despite John's healthy wage, they actually had to rely on Alma to provide the down payment for their home.
Ooh.
And John started feeling like he just wasn't earning enough. Less than 6 months later, John was offered a new job at Xerox, an up-and-coming company, with a salary of $12,000 a year. And today, that's almost $110,000.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's not too shabby.
It's not like he wasn't making a decent wage. And with more money, John just felt like things would surely get better. Sadly, though, that wasn't true. Helen was unhappy, and it didn't seem to matter what he did. He even agreed to have a vasectomy for Helen's health, a thing that was not supported by his religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And it was not actually something that he would even admit to his mother. But it was something that Helen wanted, and so he felt like, okay, if this is what you need to be happy, I'm willing to do this. And I think it's understandable if you consider her health. She struggled to take care of the kids they had. And after reading all the reports about John's unyielding personality, I think actually because he submitted to this, he was happy enough to bend his beliefs in this matter because he saw the sense in it. The pros and cons all added up neatly for him and all pointed to one solution, that they just couldn't handle any more children.
And they were blessed with 3 plus Brenda.
But it was one of the points in his life that actually show that John can change his ideologies and his frame of reference to make a new decision based on the circumstances that he's in.
Right, because that had conflicted with his original beliefs about having a vasectomy.
That's right. And later, as we get into his admitted motives for why he commits this crime and the arguments that the defense use, I think it really is important to point that out, is that there are times in his life that he can change his mind about really strongly held beliefs. And this is one of those times.
Which would contradict what the defense is later going to try and say.
That's right. So after the vasectomy that he had to make Helen happy, John dug into work even more, working more hours to provide for the family's ever-growing wish list. But as he works more, Helen becomes even more resentful, starting to lash out at John both in private and outside of the house.
Ooh, that would not go over well. Having your wife bad talking you and getting after you in public, that would look really badly for a man. That would not be well tolerated in the community or by John, likely.
No. In private, it's one thing, but in public, completely another.
Yeah, you've tarnished my image, and I can only imagine what Alma would have thought of that.
Yeah. So in private, Helen would attack his manhood and make backhanded comments about how John was not at all like her first husband.
Oh.
Brenda, in an interview later, would say that her mom was, quote, really boozing it up by then. She kept saying that she couldn't forget Melvin, that John was nothing compared to him. She was on heavy doses of medication, and Daddy couldn't control her. When John showed no emotion over this, Helen just got even more angry.
Well, yeah, she was saying it to get a reaction out of him.
Yeah, but he was just this person that had no personality that she couldn't get riled up. The only time that Brenda could recall John ever showing emotion towards her mother was when she had teased him about his military haircut, a style that never changed for him. Brenda said, quote, he just sat there reading and she kept on teasing him. Finally, he stood up, his face got all blotchy, and he threw the table and all the dishes to the floor.
Whoa.
Brenda remembered being terrified by this incident because it was so out of character for John.
Yeah, I can totally see how that would be so shocking coming from this timid, quiet man. And over a haircut. Unless it's not really over the haircut. You know, there's always that one little catalyst that pushes it over.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that that's what it was. But in public, the humiliation didn't end either. At events and work parties that the couple were expected to attend, John was socially awkward and Helen was the life of the party, flirting with other men and frequently drinking too much.
Aww.
And if that wasn't enough, Helen would often call his office and leave messages for him that his secretary would then dutifully report in front of others. Messages like, quote, your wife called and said that your son messed his pants. If you want them changed, come home and do it.
Oh, wow.
At the time, John was working for a firm that prided itself on being this family company that was forward thinking. And so they did allow John the ability to just kind of come and go as he needed to. And he would do just that.
So he'd go home and change the diaper?
When Helen demanded it, he would return home even though it mortified him that people knew he had to do this.
Yeah, it's not what would have been considered manly in the time.
Not at all.
And like now, it's more realized that men should be changing diapers as well. But either husband or wife, you shouldn't be calling your spouse at work and saying, come home and change their diaper.
Not when you're at home.
No, either one of you shouldn't be doing that to the other.
It's just bizarre. And Helen's behavior would get the blame when John was overlooked for promotions. He thought that she was the reason. Every time he was overlooked for a promotion in this company, he was like, oh, that's because Helen was calling into my work. That's because she made such a spectacle at that party. Really, the real reason, though, was John himself. He was just too rigid and cold that it made working with him really difficult.
But then you can see how the resentment would start to build in him towards his wife.
And all of this was happening in the 60s. It was 1965, and John was not handling the new social culture very well. His need for absolute order and his rule-following patriotic ways did not lend themselves well to the 60s.
He was not about burning the bra.
No, he was not about the hippie movement and free love.
Yeah.
After repeatedly asking for a more prestigious title, Xerox eventually had to let John go to look for different employment. And this was one of the first times that they didn't pad his leaving.
I wonder how like CEOs of company like Xerox even feel later knowing we employed this terrible family annihilator.
Yeah. And I think that his failings at work really show that Helen wasn't the only person to be annoyed by John's personality and his quirks. He was apparently as stiff and emotionless as they come. It was even reflected in the way that he walked, stiffly and squarely. There were so many reports from so many people that knew him that said he just had this certain way of walking, that he was just completely stiff.
And this is why we let our children play and get dirty and explore the world around them. It's needed.
I think it's funny that you bring up being dirty when you play, because even when John was doing his yard work, he had this extremely odd habit of always wearing his suit and tie.
While he's doing yard work?
So he would be out cutting the grass in a full suit and tie.
That's what I mean. You can't get more stiff than that.
No.
But he never was allowed to do anything but that.
He didn't know any different. He had always been taught to dress super neatly, to be really clean. And so he didn't know how to get dirty.
Right. He didn't know how to have fun.
And one of the habits that a lot of people picked on too was the way that John read the newspaper. Apparently he would read the newspaper front to back, each section. He would take one section out, he would read every single word on it, and then he would put it back precisely the way it came out so that you wouldn't even know the newspaper had been read.
Like one paper at a time? He wouldn't hold it all together.
No, he had to take out each section.
So he could be more careful with it.
That's right.
Wow. So he wasn't that dad with his leg crossed, flinging the paper straight.
No, not at all. John had to do everything very meticulous, in order, all the time.
Huh. And it's the newspaper. That's going into the recycling when you're done.
And it happened every day.
Huh.
To make matters worse at this time, Helen's syphilis was progressing and was causing symptoms from cerebral atrophy. She was having periods of disorientation and paranoia. For several weeks, she was actually confined to her bed. Her condition was not helped again by the alcohol and antidepressants, which at the time were mostly tranquilizers.
Yeah, that would not be a good mix.
No. Young Patty was now given the tasks of most of the household chores at the age of 10, while her dad searched for yet another job. Brenda by this time had moved out, starting her own life. One neighbor said that John Jr. and Frederick followed Patty, quote, around like anxious puppies.
Well, they're just looking for some kind of parental figure, it sounds like.
And Patty was it. It wasn't John or Helen. John eventually found a job, a good one, with a title that he liked and an even better salary. He was hired to be the vice president and comptroller at the First Nations Bank in New Jersey, earning $25,000 a year. Or just over $200,000.
That's pretty good coin.
It was a pretty prestigious job, and the prestige was what John needed to boost his confidence or his ego. The new job necessitated a move, and John found the perfect house to make Helen happy and prove that he was a man of prestige. He found Breeze Knoll.
And that's why he bought such a huge house for their small family.
Yep, with its 10 fireplaces and huge kitchen, John was sure Helen would love it. And Helen did. Helen was reported to be very passionate about cooking, and was really talented. She had had hundreds of cookbooks. Her sister said like 350.
Oh, wow.
So the kitchen with its full butler's pantry was a huge selling feature for her. She loved the house that John presented her with.
Yeah, it sounds like an amazing house, to be honest.
The house's tax assessment was $100,000 at the time, but it was actually listed much lower because the house was already in ill repair when they bought it. But that didn't dissuade Helen or John from dreaming. They lowballed the list price of the home and made grand plans to fix the house up to its original glory. John, always a history buff, had even collected photos of the house from its glory days to make sure that the restorations were precise.
And how sad knowing what we do, like what would end up happening in that house.
Yeah, when they moved into that house, they had such dreams. But the only problem with all of their big plans was that they had still not saved any money. And the $10,000 down payment was a huge chunk of change to put down, and they didn't have it.
That's a huge chunk of change today.
That's how Alma came to live with her son's family. Alma agreed to give them money once more for a down payment on one condition, that she got to live in the apartment on the 3rd floor. Helen wanted Breeze Knoll more than she didn't want her mother-in-law.
She's like, okay, fine.
Yeah. Not that she had changed her tune towards her mother-in-law anymore, but she just wanted the house.
Well, and she's been motivated by money.
Sadly, this was not a good arrangement for poor 79-year-old Alma. She would confide in friends that she was the unhappiest that she had ever been while she lived at Breeze Knoll. And I think that is just so sad.
It really is for the end of your life to be spent that way. Especially she probably had such high expectations. She's obsessed with her child and thinking, I finally get to live with him again, his family, this is going to be great.
Yeah. Westfield was supposed to have been a haven for the family, and for a while it was. John was tickled pink to have his whole family, along with his mother, attending church with him, and him proudly serving as a Sunday school teacher again. But all of this didn't last. His unyielding nature was very strict for the youth he taught, and parents started complaining. And it wasn't long before Helen would start leaving early, taking Patty with her. When the children had been little, it was only Helen that he didn't know how to control. But as the children got older and were exposed to more people and influences, he felt like he could no longer control them as well.
Well, and especially if Helen is telling them, come on, let's go.
Yeah.
There's that conflict between the two of them.
Providing it out for them, right?
Yeah.
John became even more strict and became that crazy neighbor mowing his lawn in his suit, yelling at kids to stay off the yard. He feared his kids succumbing to all of the hippie ideologies that were circulating.
Right.
So he's just kind of spiraling now. He just can't handle all of these things that are going on in his life.
Right.
John's oddities.
It's because he was raised by his great-great-uncle. That's a lot of generations behind him.
That's some old-fashioned ideologies that he's been impressed with. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'll leave it alone now, maybe.
No, you won't. We'll hear more about it. John's oddities and the need to control everything really started to stick out. He volunteered for positions in the community, but was not well liked. As a Boy Scout leader, he was described as being methodical and arrogant, being very judgmental when a boy showed up with his uniform slightly out of place, shoes not shined, or even worse, his hair past his collar. Because he had this super huge belief in that military crew cut
that he had kept his whole life. Does he have like OCD or anything like that? Because it's seeming like maybe he has some of those tendencies.
Yeah, there's reports later on that he is diagnosed with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is a little bit different than just OCD.
All right.
Yeah, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
So just a year after moving his family to Westfield and purchasing this huge fixer-up mansion, John lost his prestigious job at the bank. The job required someone with social skills, and while John had always struggled in this department, he was deteriorating even more, and John just couldn't do this job.
It's too bad he couldn't have found a job where he could have done the whole number thing and not had to interact with people.
Right, but it seemed like he always sought after these prestigious titles that would have to include him interacting with people. He always wanted to be the vice president of, or have this title behind his name that would then make him interact with people. He wasn't just happy to be the accountant at the desk.
Right, he couldn't be in a cubicle on his own.
No.
That makes sense.
Which is sad because that's probably where he would have flourished. John would be out of work for 6 months. The whole time, he didn't tell Helen. He just kept pretending to go to work. Every morning, he would leave with a briefcase in hand and then go and sit the whole day at the train station reading the Wall Street Journal. Then he would return home like nothing was amiss. John said about this later, quote, I grew up with the idea that you should provide for your family, and to do that, you had to be a success in the job that you had, or you were a failure, and that was not a good thing to be. He refused to go on welfare, as that would have entailed excruciating embarrassment in the community and violated the principles of self-sufficiency that he had learned at his father's knee.
Well, you can see how this would be a huge crossroads for him. But it's interesting why you're going to the train station and sitting and reading a newspaper rather than trying to find a job. How are you going to find a job sitting there at the train station?
Right. And I really think that this speaks to the deterioration that John was going through at this time. Like he was just mentally collapsing, because every other time that he had been asked to kind of move on from his job, or he had to find a new job because one company was closing, he hit the streets, he did his social networking, he found another job that was even more prestigious than the last. And this time he just couldn't do that.
Well, and he was vice president now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so where are you going to go from there?
Right.
He's probably not going to get a president, like the CEO kind of job, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and he's no longer being shuffled to a new company. He's actually being fired. So I think it's just all kind of falling apart for him.
And I always, when you hear stuff like this happening, how are people pulling that off for so long? Because it doesn't sound like they have this huge reserve of money. Like, how are you even supporting your family for 6 months?
Well, we'll get into that. There are some reports that while he hadn't told Helen about being unemployed, a most grievous sin in his eyes because of his father's teaching, he had confided in his mother.
Oh, mommy's paying the bills.
Well, whether he had confided in his mom or not, he actually didn't tell her that he started to use her bank account to pay all the bills.
Oh, so he's stealing from mom.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
John eventually found work again in 1967 with American Photographic Company for half of the money that he had been making before. But even this job would not last. Within a year, the company had relocated and John wasn't invited to tag along. John had to take out a second mortgage on the house and began to quietly sell furniture and cars.
Well, and you can see how this would be such a hit to his ego, right? He is just all about the prestige, what everyone is perceiving him to be.
Mm-hmm. And he's trying to keep up those appearances in the community. Even his spending habits, he goes out and he buys the best of whatever he's buying. So he's buying name brands and trying to keep up all of these appearances when they can't afford it at all.
No, you can buy great value mac and cheese.
No. John had to have KD.
With the fancy ketchup.
That's right.
Fancy Dijon ketchup.
But he was selling things off on the side, trying to kind of keep up appearances.
But you can see how he would, because he would want to hide that, because he would be basically, in his eyes, admitting to being a failure.
Mm-hmm.
So he's trying to keep up these appearances, and that is a dangerous web that he's starting to spin.
Yeah. He did eventually find another job of selling insurance and mutual funds. But again, that's a sales job. It's like the worst kind of job for him.
Yeah, because you need people skills.
Which he lacked. So he wasn't able to bring in enough money to keep up with the family's spending. And he kept dipping even deeper into Alma's accounts.
Well, and Helen just is going to continue spending because she thinks that money is continuing to come in.
That's right. During this time, Helen's condition was taking a turn for the worse. She was hospitalized at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, where her condition of cerebral atrophy was diagnosed as a symptom of general paresis, a fatal disease. It was tertiary syphilis.
Oh.
When Helen returned home, she was very ill and kept mostly to her room. Because of her disease or her dislike for John, she stopped censoring anything that she said to him and openly degraded him. She was not shy about the fact anymore that she preferred her first husband's sexual abilities and that John left her unfulfilled.
But he also gave her syphilis.
Mm-hmm. But she would just blurt this out in front of their whole family.
Oh.
Which just further humiliated him.
Yeah, that's gotta be tough.
Mm-hmm.
That's just mean, like, honestly.
It is, but because of changes in her brain that were happening because of her medical condition, she had no filter anymore.
So that was inhibited, that part of her brain?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's not like she had control over it. She was
Right.
actually sick. So Helen comes across in this story as being pretty mean, but there's a reason why she's being mean.
Oh, yeah. If that's part of her condition, then that's just what it is. That's understandable. And she shouldn't be blamed for that then.
No.
And he should have been more understanding.
But at the time, they didn't know a lot about this condition either.
Oh, okay.
And so he didn't get it at all. And even other people didn't understand what Helen was going through.
Right.
Like, there are really conflicting reports about Helen from neighbors. Some say that she was this batty woman that never would wave to them, always kept to herself, was really standoffish. And then there were other reports from the children's friends that would say whenever they saw her, she was this super nice woman that was kind and way nicer than John and more inviting and welcoming.
And both can be true.
Yeah, she had these personality differences.
And good days and bad days in her disease, probably.
Yeah. During this time, though, John relied heavily on Patty to do a lot of the housework chores that her mother could not do anymore as he was working from his office at home. Patty, as a teenager and wanting to explore her own interests, was not thrilled, but dutifully complied. A boyfriend of Patty's said that she missed a lot of classes at Westfield High because of her mom's illness.
And with John being raised in such an old-fashioned mindset, it's not surprising that he would put that only on his daughter. It's
That's
not
right.
like to all of the children, okay, mom's sick, we all need to chip in and help. No, I have a daughter, she has to take that over, which is totally unfair for her.
But it's just how it was at the time. It was expected of her. But as any teenager does, Patty started to push her father's boundaries. And this angered John because he felt that she was turning out like her mother. In the last 8 months of her life, Patty, or Pat as her friends called her, discovered a drama group, and she became enthralled with the stage. John was not impressed. He felt her new drama friends were not a good influence, especially when her first performance on stage in the spring of 1971, she ran out in front of the audience in just her bathing suit, giving a little shimmy shake, and had a boy catcall her from the audience.
Oh, yeah, that would not have gone over well.
No. John was horrified. He had already believed that any career in acting was this huge corruption.
Oh, he totally would with his strong beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that any dad would like to see his teenage daughter shaking it on the stage in her bathing suit.
That is true. I can't imagine my husband enjoying that with our teenage daughters.
No, mine neither.
But Patty had found something that she loved, and she pushed her father on the subject. And she was also pushing the limits with her dress, language, and attitude. A friend described her like this, quote, Patty at 16 was the most independent young woman that I had ever known. She had an attitude and an outlook that people her age admired and even envied. She had outward qualities of brazenness, haughtiness, and nonchalance, but inward qualities of warmth and kindness. She had a tremendous allure as a girl of 16.
Well, she had to grow up pretty quick.
In the summer of 1971, she and a friend were picked up by the police for being rowdy in the streets in the wee hours of the morning. She had snuck out and got herself picked up by the police.
She sounds awesome, actually.
She's just having a good time. She's a teenager.
Yeah, and under so much pressure. You know, it was rather, I'm going to live under my dad's thumb or I have to make my own way.
Yeah. John showed up in a suit and tie to the police station at 2:30 a.m. to collect his daughter.
Did he sleep in his suit and tie? No, or did he get out of bed and put it on to go to the police station?
I'm assuming he put it on. But it was pointed out by Patty's friend's father, who also came to pick him up, that he showed up in his pajamas.
Yeah.
His casual clothes. But he pointed out that John had taken the time to actually put himself together in a suit and tie to come at 2:30 in the morning to the police station.
Right, where most people are like, you throw on some sweats and a ball cap and you go.
That's right.
Maybe he had a sleeping suit.
Maybe. He just slept in his suit all the
Day
time.
suit, sleep suit.
Whatever he had shown up in, John was not happy. He started ranting and raving about Patty's behavior in the police station, calling her a witch. At the time, no one thought too much about this, but it later surfaced that Patty was dabbling in witchcraft, rejecting her father's Christian beliefs.
Ooh.
It's not known if this is what John meant by calling her a witch, but I thought it was interesting enough to point out.
Yeah, and it's even surprising that he would say that in public even. Like, that is not what is common, it seems, to his personality up to that point.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of things, too, that in John's behavior point out that he didn't actually know Patty was practicing witchcraft. Patty, up until her death, did continue to sing in the choir at church to appease her father, but several friends and counselors from the summer camp that she had attended all said that she was getting deep into the occult. Her friends claim that she had renounced the church, just like her mother had when she had requested her names be removed from the official rolls. There was also rumors that Patty was using drugs and seeking to have a relationship with her drama instructor, as per his account. This is a little suspicious because other students do not support this version of events at all. They say that the guy was just a creep around a lot of the teenage girls.
And hello, that is not the flex you think it is.
No.
Like, that looks
Not
so
at all.
badly on you.
But there are some points to his stories that are hard to refute. He was worried enough about her to frequently visit her house after her disappearance, and he says that Patty confided in him her fears about her father wanting to kill her prior to her death. The account of this incident that had made Patty think this is pretty similar to the one given later in life by John in his memoir. But we'll come back to that incident. With parenting problems, on top of marital problems, on top of money problems, everything was adding up for John. And the summation that he reached was that something strategic had to be done to fix the situation he was in. On October 14th, John, ever the rule follower, went to the police department to apply for a gun permit. His fingerprints were taken and filed, but he would never return for the permit.
So you had to actually get it at the police station.
On October 30th, in a rare moment of giving, he allowed Patty to host a Halloween party at his house. And this may not seem like such a big deal, but knowing John's history, I think it's huge. As a child, John had been taunted and teased because he was not allowed to take part in Halloween activities because his father thought that it was not a wholesome activity. Kids had actually taunted him, calling him Trick-or-Treat Johnny, as his father chased trick-or-treaters away. Halloween was not a holiday that John celebrated.
No, I'm actually so shocked to learn that.
I think John allowing Patty to host this Halloween party really points out to him coming to terms with what he was about to do. He was no longer trying to save Patty's soul on earth. He already had a plan to ensure that. So he's like, do whatever you want, because I'm going to take care of it all in the end.
Oh, that's so eerie.
During this party, the boys, John Jr. and Fred, crept down the stairs to watch the party. From those that attended, the party was actually pretty low-key, with Patty turning people away at the door because John had set limits on how many people could come into the house. At one point in the evening, John even chased one boy out of the house because he was stressed about how much activity was going on. So while he had granted her this permission to have friends over, he was not okay with it.
It was probably killing him inside. He was up on the stairs looking down in his suit and tie.
That's
like,
right.
What do I do here?
The recounts given by Patty's friends that attended the party are nothing like what is depicted in the movie created by Mr. Iliano later. But during the party, guests did notice how sparsely the house was furnished. So they're starting to notice that things aren't quite what they seem from the outside of this family that they think has it all put together.
Right. Well, when they're wearing all the most expensive clothing and the house looks ginormous.
From the outside.
Yeah, they're expecting to be wowed when they get in.
Exactly. On Friday night, November 5th, John sat his children down in the kitchen. As they were all gathered, John advised them that it was important to prepare to die. John asked them, when they did die, would they prefer to be buried or cremated?
What?
When he had their answers, he just walked out of the room and calmly shut himself in his office.
That's scary. Like, why would a dad even ask you that?
That's what Patty's feelings were. She discussed this incident with her drama teacher, Mr. Iliano. She expressed her fear that her father was actually going to kill them. At the time, Iliano dismissed her fears, thinking that no father would ever do that. But she pressed the fact and said that if he heard about their father taking them away, be warned, because that's how she felt he was going to cover up their murders. No one really knows if this interaction took place, but I think there are arguments to be made for both sides. John does say in his memoirs that this is what he did. He sat his children down and asked them whether they wanted to be buried or cremated. And then Edwin Iliano, he comes back and says Patty told him about this incident. In his recount to reporters later on, he's bawling his eyes out saying that I didn't take her seriously.
Oh, that's really sad. And did he recount that after he read John's memoir, or did he say it before?
His movie came out around the same time.
So hard to say.
It is really hard to say, but I think there's arguments for both sides. So I don't know which one actually happened, but it does sound like a for sure thing that John sat his children down and asked them, when you die, do you want to be buried or cremated?
Yeah, because why would John lie about that?
And there were other friends of Patty's that would say in the days before their unexpected trip was announced that Patty had been nervous and fearful of her father.
Oh, that would be so hard, regardless if we think the drama teacher's a creep or not, like to have heard that and not acted on it and just kind of brushed it aside.
Yeah. In Iliano's version of events, he does claim that that fear extended to the boys too. That when he was at the house on the night of the 7th, that John Jr. had shook his hand and had invited him to stop by at any time in a very stern, kind of unusual way, as if he was trying to pass along a message. If that message was being sent, though, it wasn't received. On November 9th, the day began like any other. John got up with his kids, had breakfast with them, and got them off to school. Once they left, he was ready to carry out his carefully laid plans. The night before, he had stayed awake, sitting amongst his walls of crime books and military strategy games, waiting for what he was now about to do. When Helen came downstairs for breakfast, John chatted with her briefly while sneaking up behind her and shot her in the left side of her head, killing her with one shot from 18 inches away with the 9mm automatic pistol his father had given him, all while she was just trying to drink her morning coffee.
Oh, that's so terrible.
Quickly, he headed up to the 3rd floor where his mother was preparing to eat breakfast. He gave her a kiss good morning, dodging her question about the noise that she had just heard from downstairs.
Well, I was just thinking that would have been loud.
Later, John said that he felt just like Judas as he delivered a kiss just prior to shooting her in the left temple at point-blank range.
Oh.
John attempted to move his mother's body, but it was too heavy for him, so he covered her face with a towel and returned to the kitchen and dragged his wife's body into the ballroom. After cleaning up the blood in the kitchen, he sat down to write notes and make phone calls telling people about their expected absence to take care of an ailing relative in North Carolina. He then went outside to rake some leaves and was seen by a neighbor that he refused to wave to.
He went out and raked leaves?
He just needed to kill time in his morning.
And were the kids at school at this point? Why even raking the leaves? You're about to flee. You're not even going to stay there.
He just needed it to look pristine.
It's really interesting. I feel like there could be a whole paper written on the analogy between John and the house. Because John, it only matters what he looks like on the outside. It doesn't matter what's inside. It's pretty hollow and empty inside. And same with the house. It only matters what the outside looks like, but inside it's unfurnished and bare.
And falling apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. That would be so interesting.
Yeah, I think someone needs to do a research paper on that because I feel like there's such a correspondence between those two things. He created a home that was like himself.
Emotionless and devoid of any feeling.
Yeah, no personality on the inside. And it only mattered what looked like outside.
Yeah.
So now it actually makes sense to me that he was outside raking leaves.
Well, and if that little fact hadn't convinced you that John was cold and emotionless, after he rakes leaves, he went inside, made himself lunch, and sat down to eat at the table where he had shot his wife just hours before.
Oh my goodness.
Years later, in an interview, John would justify his ability to eat by stating with a chuckle that I was just hungry. That's just the way it was.
Oh, yeah, I can't even imagine coming and sitting back at the table where you just shot your wife and, I'm going to make myself a sandwich.
The next sequence of events gets a little confusing, but this is what I was able to piece together from timelines of witnesses and bank stamps. We know that John's plans were slightly interrupted when Patty called home shortly after lunchtime, wanting to be picked up from school because she wasn't feeling well. John obliged, picking her up around 12:30, but seeing no reason to stop now, he just moved up his timeline. We know when he pulled into the driveway, he quickly went into the house before her, and as she walked in, he shot her in the jaw with his antique .22 pistol, a souvenir he had kept from his time in the war. He dealt with her body just like he had Helen's, and again cleaned up the blood. We also know that he ran some errands that day around the same time. He cashed a check at the Suburban Trust Company, mailed a letter at the post office, and then went to a different teller to have his mail stopped. He stopped again at a bank to cash a check out of his mom's account this time at a drive-in bank branch, and then went to his mother's bank and cashed in the remainder of his mom's $2,000 in savings bonds at 1:37 in the afternoon. Overall, he had $2,285 in cash, leaving just $2,414 behind in any of the accounts. We are not sure if he already had murdered Patty at this point, or if she was actually waiting in the car for her dad to take her home.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say, how do you do this after shooting your daughter?
The two timelines kind of coincide together, and there are a lot of reports that say that he went to the bank in the morning and then he shot Patty, and then there are some reports that say he shot Patty and then went to the bank. But just knowing the time frames, it all seems to happen at the same time. And the only thing that I can think of is that Patty was waiting in the car while he was doing all this.
Well, he had to be efficient. He was out to pick her up. I better run my errands and then we'll deal with it.
That's what I think happened.
And maybe he left that little bit of money to make it look like, I'm coming back.
Maybe.
Like, we're just going on this holiday.
Yeah, I don't know why you're cleaning out all the accounts. Why don't you clean it out, all of it?
It's odd.
We do know that he returned home to wait for his boys. Next to come home was Fred, and this I think is so sad. Fred too came home a little bit earlier than planned. He had gone to his after-school job at KMV Associates where he and Patty both worked. But when Fred found out that Patty had gone home early, he was concerned about her, and he called home asking where Patty was. And then he asked to come home early too.
What a good brother.
He was concerned about his sister. John shot him the same way he had the others, by a surprise attack, and laid his body out next to Patty on the Boy Scout sleeping bag. After dispatching 2 of his children, John drove to the soccer field where John Jr. was playing and watched him play. He then drove his namesake home to meet the same fate. Some people theorize that John Jr. must have been suspicious about his dad when he entered the house, because it seems like he got a little bit of a jump on him. John Jr. struggled, unlike any of the other victims. He was shot at least 10 times in the chest and face.
Oh my goodness.
It would have emptied both of John's guns. Later, John would say, quote, "I don't know whether it was only because he was still jerking that I wanted to make sure that he didn't suffer, or that if it was some sort of way of relieving tension after having completed what I felt was my assignment for the day."
Whoa.
His assignment for the day, like checking groceries off of his list. It's so heartless.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just totally dissociated himself from the situation.
Yeah, it was just something he needed to carry out. When his son stopped jerking, John dragged him into the ballroom and laid him on his own sleeping bag beside his siblings in the ballroom. Having completed his work, he then said a prayer over his family from the Lutheran hymnal. After John cleaned up the blood for a 3rd time, John stacked the garbage bags by the back door and made himself supper.
Oh.
The postman came around 5 p.m. to deliver a letter that John had mailed himself earlier in the day. He left it unopened for police to find later. That evening, around 7 p.m., he called his pastor and gave him the same story as everyone else, that they planned to be out of town for a bit. Around 7:30, he did the same for Patty's drama group, explaining that Patty would not be able to be the understudy for Blanche in the upcoming production of A Streetcar Named Desire. Finally, he sat down and penned a 5-page letter to the same pastor he had just lied to, and wrote instructions for whoever would find the bodies. After his full day, he slept in the same house where his dead family members were starting to decompose.
Oh. So did these instructions include their desires as to what they want to happen to their bodies?
Funeral arrangements?
Oh.
Yep.
Oh, and I don't know how you could stay in the home.
I don't know how he did that either. But he did say that it was the best night's sleep he had gotten in a long time.
No way.
He just felt all the pressure was off. The next morning, John cut his face out of all the photo albums in the house. Then he turned down the thermostat to 50, turned on all the lights, and turned the intercom on to the radio station WQXR FM, the only one he had ever allowed to be played in the house. Police would later believe that the thermostat was turned down to slow decomposition, and the lights in the radio were left on to prolong the time that the bodies were discovered. John would admit that it was actually because he was being conscientious of the heating bill, but wanted to make sure that it was not so cold in the house that the pipes would burst. There was no sense in costing the bank more costly repairs when they took it over.
Whoa.
It was also for that reason that he left on the lights and the music. He felt that it would deter robbers. So he was just protecting the bank's investment.
No way. Do you think that's true?
That's what he said.
Wow. That makes him so much more heartless, but it just shows how he's just almost like this robot.
He's just adding up. These are the things that need to be done, and how do we protect our assets, and what are our
Yeah.
liabilities?
But it's surprising too, because he's leaving on lights and music, but he's told everybody they're out of town. So wouldn't that raise suspicion?
Right, but he had thought he was going to deter the robbers.
Right. So they can't damage or take things.
That's right. He had thought this through so well.
And it sounds like he is just like mentally spiraled out of control, taking the time to cut his face out of all the photographs.
Well, he's been strategizing about this for a while. One of the pastimes that John did love to do was play military strategy games. And there were several people that said that he could not be beat at them. He was just so strategic.
And that's why he gets away with this.
On November 10th, John locked the front door and walked away, leaving behind his whole family that he had mechanically murdered without emotion.
Oh.
That door stayed locked until December 7th, when police entered the house and found the dead bodies. During their investigation, police found that there were no signs of struggle in the ballroom and that drag marks through the hallways indicated that all victims had been killed in the kitchen with the exception of Alma. In her apartment, the toast was still in the toaster from her breakfast.
Oh, means he just woke up and was like, Kate, I'm getting it done right now. He put on his little suit and was like, no time to waste. I have to get working on my to-do list.
Well, that's what he said when he killed his son, right?
Oh.
He was just done today's errands. The garbage bags with the rags that John had used to clean up the blood were stacked by the back door, waiting to be taken out to the trash. There was so much blood soaked into those rags that when left to rest for some time, it had seeped across the floor.
Oh.
Bullet casings were found on the floor and bullet holes were found in the kitchen cabinets. In John's office, police found 2 pistols, along with an envelope containing extra bullets, in the bottom right-hand drawer of the filing cabinet beside his desk. On the outside of that drawer, John had taped a note, guns and ammo. Taped on top of his desk was a note that said, To Finder, 1. Please contact the proper authorities. 2. The key to this desk is in the envelope addressed to myself. 3. The keys to the files are in the desk. On the drawer of the desk, John had taped another note, which said, To Pastor Rehinkle, Burton Goldstein, and administrators. Inside the locked drawer was a manila envelope containing apology letters to Helen's mother and sister Jean, and his own mother's friend. It also contained photocopied stock certificates, a checkbook, and an interest compilation slip. John had even composed a letter to a business associate to tie up some unfinished work. And in his letter to his boss, he outlined how debt was supposed to be repaid. It was inside this folder that the confession letter to his pastor was found, neatly handwritten on a yellow pad of lined paper dated November 9th, 71. It read, Dear Pastor Rehinkle, I am sorry to add this additional burden to your work. I know what has been done is wrong from all that I have been taught, and that any reasons that I might give will not make it right. But you are the one person that I know that, while not condoning this, will at least possibly understand why I felt I had to do this. And then he goes on to make bullet points. Number 1, I wasn't earning anywhere near enough to support us. Everything I tried seemed to fall to pieces. True, we could have gone bankrupt and maybe gone on welfare. Number 2, but that brings me to my next point. Knowing the type of location that one would have to live in, plus the environment for the children, plus the effect on them knowing they were on welfare, was just more than I thought they could and should endure. I know they were willing to cut back, but this involved a lot more than that. Number 3, with Pat being so determined to get into acting, I was also fearful as to what that might do to her continuing to be a Christian. I was sure it wouldn't have helped. Number 4, also, with Helen not going to church, I knew this would harm the children, eventually in their attendance. I had continued to hope that she would begin to come to church soon, but when I mentioned to her that Mr. Jutes wanted to pay her an elder's call, she just blew up and said that she wanted her name to be taken off the church rolls. Again, this could only have an adverse result on the children's continued attendance. So that is the sum of it. If any of these had been the condition, we might have pulled through, but this was just too much. At least I am certain that all have gone to heaven now. If things could have gone on, who knows if that would have been the case. Of course, Mother got involved because doing what I did to my family would have been a tremendous shock at her age. Therefore, knowing that she is also a Christian, I felt it best if she be relieved of the troubles of this world that would have hit her. After giving some instructions on how the funerals are to be handled, he goes on to write, Originally, I had planned this for November 1st, All Saints' Day. But travel arrangements were delayed. I thought it would be an appropriate day for them to get to heaven. He then finishes his letter saying, I am sure many will say, how could anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer? It isn't easy. It was only done after much thought. John got hurt much more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately out of pain. John didn't consciously feel anything either. Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them, whether or not the government does its duty as it sees it. I am only concerned with making my peace with God, and for this I am assured, because of Christ dying even for me. P.S. Mother is in the hallway attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move.
Melissa, oh my goodness. I have so many thoughts about that letter, but I never understand when something like this happens and they're using their religion as the reason. Like, he feels totally justified. Like, I had to do this to save my family from sin. and because I can't provide for them. But how can you ignore the fact that murder is a sin? Is he thinking he's going to make it to heaven with them? Like, if we're going by his mindset, is he going to make it there? And then to ask them to pray for him?
Yeah, and we'll get into that later. But John absolutely 100% believes that he will be forgiven and he's going to see them again in heaven.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Having a confession was no consolation to the police. They didn't have a murderer to go with that confession. And as they dug through the evidence, the confession didn't seem to be telling the whole story. Because one of the points he makes in his confession is that he shot them all from behind so that they wouldn't know who did this to them and that they wouldn't feel any extra turmoil because of that. But it was all skewed by John's own perception, because autopsies showed that contrary to his confession letter, everyone wasn't shot from behind. Actually, only Patty had been shot in the back of the head. For all the others, their last vision in life was John aiming a pistol at their heads.
Right.
The other thing that the confession didn't contain was any clue to where John had disappeared to. Given the tone of the letter, they assumed he planned not to kill himself, like most family annihilators do, but they had no clue to what he planned to do next. And this created this generalized fear in relatives and friends, thinking that they would be next.
Yeah, well, and he's emptied their bank account, so that's another indication he is not going to kill himself because he needs money to go on the run. And he's had like a 3-week head start. That just makes it even worse.
Yeah. Even people that were not directly related to the crime developed this fear of a boogeyman that lived unseen among them. The only clue to John's disappearance was that his beat-up 1963 four-door blue Chevy Impala was found in the long-term parking area, Field 8, at the Kennedy Airport on December 9th. But it was purposely planted there by John to trick the police. Placed in the front seat was a parking ticket dated November 10th. John had had almost a full month's head start. Police asked Brenda for help to try and get John to come forward. In a statement read by a pastor, she pled, "Daddy, you are all I have left. Please call me." Brenda would later say that this was the last thing she wanted. She was terrified that she would be next, but she went along with the police's plan because that was what they thought would capture him. For the next 17 years, police would have no clue where John was. The FBI was brought in, and they developed a profile of the 46-year-old. The FBI used the profile to alert key participants to watch out for John and provide them with a few pictures that were still available to them. All over the country, physicians and pharmacists were alerted to watch out for anyone seeking hemorrhoid cream because John had a real problem with hemorrhoids.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah.
That's what they're telling them?
That was one of their strategies. The other one was they put eye doctors on high alert because John's eyesight was so poor that eventually it was assumed that he would have to have his eyes checked.
That's actually so smart.
The FBI gave details that John was 6 feet tall. He was actually 6'1" and weighed 180 pounds, with black, graying hair, a fair complexion, brown eyes, and 2 distinguishing scars: a mastoidectomy scar behind his right ear and hernectomy scars on both sides of his abdomen. The flyer included this warning: List, who is charged in New Jersey with multiple murders involving members of his family, may be armed and should be considered very dangerous. And then it also added a remark about reportedly a neat dresser.
Well, he would be. Like, those are all valid things. And he is so dangerous because if he's going to kill his family whom he loves because they're not towing the line spiritually, nobody is going to live up to those expectations.
Yeah, it's just so crazy. One area that the police didn't distribute flyers to was Lutheran congregations.
What?
Yeah, I thought this was so weird.
What?
Even though they were confident that John wouldn't stay away from church long, it was considered a bad political move to mix church and state in the 1970s. And so they left out all the churches.
Where he was almost guaranteed to show up.
Police canvassed the area again and again and came up with no further leads. And the family and the community lived on in fear. Wild theories about John's disappearance were all over. One of the most famous theories was that he was the famous D.B. Cooper. On the night before Thanksgiving in 1971, 2 weeks after the List family murders, but 2 weeks before the bodies had been found, a polite, soft-spoken man described as dark-haired, middle-aged, 6 feet tall, and bespectacled hijacked flight number 305 bound for Seattle on the Northwest Orient Airlines, saying that he had a bomb in his briefcase. He forced the plane to land and pick up $200,000 in ransom money and 4 parachutes in exchange for the 36 passengers on board. And then, airborne again, he parachuted out into the howling wind at 10,000 feet over the Cascade Mountains of Washington.
So they think that was John.
There are theories, but it's a theory that has since taken a real back burner because there are more probable suspects. And when caught, John actually denies these claims, and police are pretty confident that they're able to account for him not being in Oregon at the time of the hijacking.
Yeah, it doesn't seem fitting to me.
No, but this was all the rage when all of this was happening. They're like, that must be John List. He's jumping out of a plane.
You can see how that would get exaggerated that way.
There were just all of these crazy theories.
My only question with that would be, did the hijacker wear a suit and a tie? Because then maybe, and were his shoes polished?
That's right. On August 30th, 1972, following the discovery of the bodies, the List home caught fire, originally believed to be the work of arson. The rumors over Patty practicing witchcraft really took off, probably because of the Manson murders that were happening around the same time.
Oh, yeah.
Investigators now believe that the fire was probably accidental. People at the time were breaking into the house to steal souvenirs, and teenagers had taken to gathering in Patty's room and lighting candles.
Ooh.
It was rumored that they were actually practicing like these dark arts seances.
Oh my goodness.
There is also this other crazy rumor about there being a signed Tiffany stained glass skylight in the mansion worth $100,000 that was lost during the fire. If it had been true, the value would have solved John's money troubles.
Yeah.
Most scholars and antique dealers doubt the validity of a signed skylight and say that for the time the price was just way overinflated and that the house, while pretty fancy, was not the kind of place that these skylights would have been installed. So while possible, it's not likely probable. By the 15th anniversary of the crime, the papers were still talking about the murderer who got away, but that had kind of dwindled down to once per year. So what did happen to John List? As the small town of Westfield prepared for the funeral of John's 5 family members, a funeral so big they struggled to find enough pallbearers, John was making his way across the country. He went to New York City by public transit, and then he made his way to Denver in a very roundabout way. Once he was there, he applied for a new Social Security card on November 22nd in the name of Robert P. Clark, a boy he had attended school with, but who didn't even remember who John was.
Because he was Mr. Cellophane.
That's right. He just faded into the background.
And it's just so eerie to me, things like this, knowing that he was riding the public transport systems and there's people sitting beside him saying, hello, good day, not knowing that he just murdered his whole family.
Yeah, it's not like he goes in hiding. Well, he does go into hiding, but it's not like he's hiding from interactions with people.
No, he's just out starting a new life.
Yeah. He bought a trailer with cash and settled in a mobile home park just off the Interstate 70. And for the next few years, he did keep his head down a little bit. He used public transportation when he needed to go somewhere because he didn't want to register a car. And when money started getting low, he did get a job as a short order cook at a Holiday Inn, pretty much across the road from the trailer park. Ironically, cooking for his kids over the years and learning from Helen, he had become a pretty decent cook. Even more ironically, he gained a reputation for someone who could take the pressure of a high demanding kitchen, which he couldn't take the pressure of his own life. But in this kitchen situation, he just was able to order everything perfectly and sum it up. And so he did really well.
That's ironic. And I'm always so curious too. How do you just apply and get a new social security number? Like, he wouldn't have had ID or any documents to support that that's who he is. Like, can you just, at that time, were you able to just go and say, this is who I am, I need a social security number? And they're like, okay.
That's what he did. He just walked in, said he had lost his stuff, and applied for a new one.
That's wild to me.
John worked nights and kept to the kitchen, so he wasn't actually seen a lot. But over time, John, now going by Bob, did start to make friends. Without the stress of parenting, a sick wife, and finances, he was able to present a little bit more of a facade about being likable, even personable with customers. Some that did spend extended amounts of time with him did say that he was a little cold and that there was nothing behind his eyes.
Yeah, I believe it.
In 1974, he was offered a sous chef job at the Pinery Golf and Country Club, and with the increase in cash that he was making, he got a better place to live near the University of Denver at Columbine Plaza. With everything that he did, Bob was strategic. His choice of where he lived was ideal because there were lots of people always coming and going, too busy with their own lives to take note of him. Plus, the 70s were an ideal time to get lost. With the free love, hippie atmosphere he so despised, it was easy for him to kind of hide in the background. There was no digital footprint, and people still accepted someone's word about being who they were without having to prove your claim with handfuls of documents.
You could even be like, hey, I'm a teacher. Okay, when can you start?
There was lots of industry going on at the time, and people were moving all over the place. So it was this prime time for him to get lost. By June 1975, Bob returned to church. Again, he was super strategic about this. All of his years obsessively playing military games were paying off. He chose St. Paul's Parish, that was in a transient part of the city, right off a bus line. Again, a place where people were not around long enough to actually take note of him. By spring of 1976, he was feeling confident enough to try and get a driver's license. To prove his identity, he used his 2-year relationship with the telephone company he had set up at his apartment as proof of who he was. When he applied for his license under his new name, he shaved 6 years off of his age. A little over a year later, Bob met a woman and fell in love. Dolores H. Miller, in her mid-30s, was recently divorced from a military man. She was a shy religious woman that had recently taken a job in a warehouse at the Base Exchange. She and Bob met at a single social event sponsored by the area Lutheran churches. Both were shy. From accounts of her personality, she sounded like the polar opposite of Helen.
And so similar to John.
They would date over the next 8 years, and John gradually began to relax his style, even wearing an unbuttoned collar.
What? Scandalous.
I know, right? But it does really show you that he's relaxing it around her. But he never does relax enough around her to tell her the truth about what happened to his first family. Instead, he tells her that his first wife died of cancer and that he never had any kids at all.
Oh, what a dirtbag. And that poor woman being married to him, having no idea, being totally bamboozled, not knowing what a evil little rodent you're married to.
Dolores just thought he was this kind man of good moral character.
Oh, poor Dolores. To find that out after, can you imagine?
No, it would have been awful.
And you're meeting him at a church singles thing.
Yeah, he was actively involved in the church. He was volunteering all the time, so he was just this good guy. With Dolores' encouragement, John re-entered the world of accounting and once again started to seek out titles at work. His original strategy of laying low and accepting low-paying jobs and working his way up gave over to his ambition, and he started to pad his resume with phony positions. Once again, John was strategic about it, though. Knowing that employers never look past his most recent job experience, he always put the lies farther down the list. And so he would say he had all these prestigious titles, but they were just lower down so that he figured they wouldn't be checked. Gradually, John, as Bob, began to show through more and more of his past personalities and pastimes. He constantly listened to classical music and began playing chess and military strategy games again. But no one took much notice of him. After 8 years of courtship, Dolores finally agreed to marry Bob on November 23rd, 1985.
That's a long courtship.
She just was unsure of him, which I think is so sad.
Yeah, if you're unsure for that many years, that's a bit of a flag there.
Well, she was unsure of him probably for a reason.
Yeah, he's a murderer.
But everything that she was seeing was telling her that he was this nice guy.
Yeah, on paper, he checks out.
I'm guessing that she was getting a vibe from him.
No, I wonder why she changed her mind. Like, what finally made her decide to marry him?
I don't know. Because she had been divorced once, she really wanted to be careful and not be divorced again.
Right. And 8 years, like she was in her mid-30s, now she's mid-40s, and maybe she was feeling like her opportunities were running out.
Yeah. So they were married in Maryland to be close to Dolores' family. And where they got married was just 20 miles away from where John had married Helen.
Ooh. He's getting brave.
Yeah. For John, history seemed doomed to repeat itself. He had never really learned to save, and when he lost his job because of personality clashes, just 5 months after getting married, financial troubles started happening all over again. He and Dolores were swamped down at a condominium building that was run down and not being looked after, and interest rates were skyrocketing. It was during these troubles in February 1987 that one of Dolores' friends, Wanda Flannery, pointed out an article entitled The Perfect Crime. The article that was published in the Weekly World News tabloid was about John List, who had gotten away with murdering his whole family. This was a spin-off article about the crimes from the 15th anniversary story that had been published in the newspaper.
No way.
To Wanda, her friend's husband fit John to a T. His physical appearance, his demeanor, and his mannerisms, they all matched up. So much so that she was compelled to show the article to Dolores. But Dolores just laughed at it. She thought it was ridiculous that her sweet Bob was a murderer. Dolores told Wanda later that she just threw out the paper and had never shown to her husband.
Oh my goodness. I wonder what would have happened if she did.
Yeah, I don't know.
What his reaction would be. And I'm sorry, but FBI, you need to hire Wanda.
Wait, we're not done with Wanda.
Oh, my queen.
Shortly after that, Bob and Dolores moved to Richmond, Virginia, for Bob to once again start another job. They eventually settle on a lease-to-own home in Bander Mill suburban subdivision. Bob took up John's old trait of scowling at kids that walked across his yard.
Oh, he has fallen into his old patterns.
And we see that as stress increases, he just gets more and more meticulous and that rule follower.
Yeah, he has to take control somehow.
Yeah. In 1988, a newly promoted captain in Union County, New Jersey, took an interest in the unsolved list case and after some finagling, convinced the host of a new TV show to feature the case. The show, while new, was averaging an arrest per episode. And so this new captain thought that even though it was a long shot, it was at least worth a shot. The host was John Walsh, and the show was America's Most Wanted. At the time, it was a news show that had started in February of 1988. It showed unsolved cases using reenactments and police statements, and then asked for live audience participation as police officers took calls from tipsters as the show was aired. And I don't think I ever realized this before about that show, but did you know the call lines that were behind John Walsh as he does his little recaps? They're actually police officers from the police stations that those cases come from.
No, I had no idea about that.
Yeah.
But I do remember the show.
I thought that was so interesting. Originally, the show rejected the case, saying that it was too old. But when the host, Walsh, heard about the dirtbag John, that he had killed his own children, that pulled on his heartstrings. And so he insisted that this case be aired.
Good for him.
The show contracted the services of a sculptor to create an aged 3D image of what John might look like 18 years after he murdered his family. For $1,500, using the 3 photographs that existed and the FBI profile, the artist Frank Bender went to work. The bust he created was a ringer for John. Go to our Facebook page to see a side-by-side comparison. It is eerie how well he got it.
It's amazing.
The episode about the List family aired on May 21st, 1989, and was seen by 22,000 people, and tips started rolling in. John later told his psychologist that he had caught the very end of the show when they did the recap about his crime asking for tips. He said that he was, quote, perspiring like anything, wondering if Dolores, who had also watched the show, recognized him. Apparently, she hadn't. There was some that say that this is all made up and it was just part of John telling a big story because there was a church social that night, and John rarely missed church socials. And we know from his autobiography that John is known to embellish the truth sometimes. So whether this actually happened or not, who knows?
But I hope that it did. I hope he had that moment of just sweating it, panic, poop your pants, worry.
Yeah, that would be nice. Who for sure saw the episode and recognized her old neighbor was
Wanda!
Yes! She watched the show that night, and it confirmed to her what she had thought before. Bob was John List.
Wanda was on it.
She had her son-in-law call into the tip line. On June 1st, FBI agents assigned to follow up on fugitive tips were doing their due diligence and following up on the tip that had been called in by Wanda's son-in-law. They knocked on Bob and Dolores' door in Bander Mill.
Yes.
Dolores answered. And when shown the John List flyer, she couldn't deny the resemblance. But she also just could not believe that it was actually true. According to police officers present, they handed her the flyer and she said, quote, "That looks like it could be my husband, but that can't be my husband. He's the nicest man in the world." Just to confirm, they asked to see a picture of her husband. The resemblance was uncanny, and the officers are sure that they have found their guy.
And in Dolores' defense, John has not given her any reason to suspect that he's not who he's saying he is.
That's right. And I don't know how, but somehow those detectives act all casual as they're asking about Bob. They're acting like, oh, we just have to follow up on this. Can you tell us where Bob is? And Dolores provides them with his office address. So as one officer stays with Dolores, the other one goes to Bob's office.
That's smart. So then she can't alert him.
That's right. So the officer shows up, and as he's talking to the receptionist, in walks John on his way back from the Xerox machine. He is arrested without incident at 11:10, but insists that he is Robert P. Clark.
Yeah, but he has been for the last 17 years.
This is an act that he keeps up for nearly 6 months, despite it obviously not being true. It was disproven almost right away by his fingerprints. And there are many instances where he lets it slip that he is John List. One of those times is when Dolores comes to visit him in prison. While he and Dolores are talking through the glass, his side of the conversation is taken down by a deputy that is guarding John. Basically, this deputy overhears him telling his life story to Dolores. And at the time, he doesn't think much of it. But then later, the deputy hears Dolores go on TV and say, "I don't think it's him. This is not my husband." And the deputy's like, "Wait a minute. I overheard this conversation where he told you all about it being him."
So he admitted to Dolores that, I'm John List and I murdered my family.
Yep. He makes excuses about how Helen's behavior kind of led him to all of this happening.
Dolores, when you say you're going to stand by your man, this is your little asterisk. You don't have to at this point in time. I can't even imagine what she was feeling and going through.
No, I can't put myself in Dolores' shoes at all.
No, she could have been in a state of shock even.
He was telling her all of these things that he had done as John List, but then he was still telling her that he was Bob. Oh, so bizarre. There are very few people who believe that Dolores knew anything about John's past prior to that conversation. Most believe that she was completely in the dark. Jean, Helen's sister, had a similar experience, though, with John. While he was still claiming to be Bob, she came to confront her sister's killer. While he talked about past vacations that they had shared and asked about their kids, he was still adamantly denying that he was John List. It does make me wonder if John himself was confused about whether he was Bob or John.
I think he was. I think there's a lot of things going on here mentally with John throughout this whole case.
Yeah. It wasn't until February 16, 1990 that John finally admitted that he wasn't Bob. So it took some time. In March, he underwent a psych eval, and in his own words, he justified his crime by saying, quote, "I was unemployed. I couldn't do well at a job. I was borrowing money from mother. Helen was getting worse. I was praying something would happen. The pressure was building up. I couldn't function. I was concerned at the way I was raised. I was always told to handle my own problems. My mother and Helen knew there were problems, but I didn't let them know how bad they were." He said he was worried about Patty's friends' use of marijuana, although he doesn't say he was aware that Patty herself was smoking, and that he says, quote, "I was concerned that she and the boys would drift away from the church." He explained once again, quote, "I couldn't support them. Finally, I broke and I killed them. I thought that if I killed them all, my family would go to heaven." So then people asked him later on, like, "Why didn't you commit suicide?" And this was John's answer, quote, "If I committed suicide, there would be 100% automatically that I would go to hell." Then he goes on to say, quote, "I didn't really think that I would get away with it for more than a week or two. When I did get away with it for so long, I was surprised. I decided to stay free as long as I could. I might have had it on my mind to turn myself in, but I never gave it serious consideration. I was afraid of the consequences. I was afraid of going to jail for a long time." After being extradited back to New Jersey, the trial began in April with a court-appointed attorney for John because, big surprise, he didn't have enough savings to pay for one himself.
Oh.
During that trial, it wasn't really about whether John had committed the murders, but if he was in his right mind when he did commit them. Was he deliberate in killing his family and therefore guilty of 5 first-degree murder charges that were being brought against him? All the psychologists agreed that John was not insane, but the defense psychologists did argue that at the time of the crime, because of his obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, that once he had rationalized his plan and convinced himself that the only way to save his family's souls was to kill them, he was unable to deviate from his plan. The main prosecution psychologist that had interviewed John for 4 hours said that John had experienced a midlife crisis, pretty much saying that John just needed to rid himself of his problems and that during his assessment, John had not shown, quote, anything that approached genuine remorse. He did not feel the enormity of guilt or remorse or sadness at the loss of his family. I think he's a rather cold-blooded individual. That doctor pointed out the lies in the confession letter and that John had frequently switched back and forth on his motivation for killing his family, choosing whatever one best suited him at the time. After a much longer time to deliberate than was expected, it was about 9 hours, the jury of 6 men and 3 women returned a verdict on April 12th of guilty on all 5 accounts. The lengthy decision was because one juror was sympathetic and felt that John might not have been capable of changing his mind because of his rigid nature, like the defense argued. The confession letter held the key piece of information that changed their mind. In it, John had said that he was originally going to kill his family on the 1st, but had delayed because of travel arrangements. They felt that this showed that he did actually have the ability to change his plan and that it wasn't set in stone.
Right, which it does.
I think it points to that clearly. And the same thing about his vasectomy, that even though he had some really strong feelings about it, he's able to change what he's doing.
And he allowed the Halloween party. Regardless if he knew he was going to kill them or not, he still went against his beliefs and let the party happen.
That's right. All of those things I think point to that the reason why he murdered his family was out of spitefulness for his wife and convenience for him. He's just feeling overwhelmed and needed to start over again.
Right. Why didn't you just do what many dads have done before? Go out to get the milk and you just don't come back.
Yeah.
As terrible as that is, better than murdering your entire family.
So crazy. John List was sentenced on May 1st, 1990 to 5 consecutive life sentences in prison without the eligibility for parole. The judge said, "The name of John Emil List will be eternally synonymous with concepts of selfishness, horror, and evil." John did appeal his sentence on the grounds that his judgment had been impaired by post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service, and that the unsealed letter to his pastor should have been kept confidential.
Oh, no. Sorry, honey.
These appeals were denied. John spent his time in jail, reading the Bible, writing letters to his friends that he had made as Bob Clark. And when he wrote these letters, he went on like he was Bob Clark.
I just can't even imagine being that friend and getting this letter after finding out. Like, you would feel so betrayed even as a friend to find that out.
You would think, but they actually carried on writing letters back and forth to him because they knew him as Bob Clark, this nice stand-up guy that was pleasant.
Wow.
He spent many hours with a deck of cards and a notepad calculating statistical odds and spent time with the Lutheran minister. Dolores never came to visit John after that first time. She called and for a while tried to maintain a relationship, but it was reported, although not substantiated, that she quietly got a divorce a few years later. John later did an interview with Connie Chung in 2002 and told her what he thought his reunion would be like in heaven with his family. He said, quote, "I feel when we get to heaven, we won't worry about these earthly things. They'll either have forgiven me or won't have realized, you know, what happened. I'm sure that if we recognize each other, that we'll like each other's company just as we did here when times were better." John told her that he didn't kill himself after killing his own family because he felt that it would prevent him from getting to heaven. All he wanted was to be reunited with his wife, mother, and children in the afterlife, where he believed there would be no pain or suffering.
This is so bizarre. I don't think they're going to be happy to see you, John. I hate to burst your bubble. And when we don't have to worry about these earthly things, like these little bumps in the road that we have to go through, savagely murdering your entire family is not just a little bump in the road.
That's how deluded his thinking was. And in his eyes, he had taken care of the problem. He had fixed it. By sending them to heaven, he had fixed all their problems.
Yeah, we're all going to be happy later. Yeah. But I'm going to be a little coward and run, and I'm not going to own up to anything, and I get to live my own life like a selfish dirtbag.
Yeah. In 2006, with the help of an admirer, John published a memoir titled Collateral Damage, The John List Story. It came across as self-serving, really pushing the PTSD angle that the courts had already thrown out. 2 years later, on March 21st, 2008, at the age of 82, John died from complications of pneumonia. No one claimed his body.
Good.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. So that is the case of John List, the evil dirtbag that murdered his family to cover up his own failures and was so emotionless about it that he started a whole new life, never looking back.
Wow. He is on the top of the charts of dirtbags. And Melissa, I learned so many new things about this case. I've heard this one a lot, and this was a beast.
I am so happy to be done with it.
But we hope that you enjoyed it, Ivy, and we hope that all of our listeners enjoyed it as well.
And we'll see you again next week when Christy brings us another case.
Until then,
see ya.
Bye. we're still eating chocolate and we're about to record.
When are we not eating chocolate?
That's the better question.
Yeah. No side of murder.
No. Don't put this in here, bitch.
Sorry. Is this all making...
It's
Did it
great.
flow?
It's
Okay.
fantastic.
She falls asleep.
Her great uncle.
Stop laughing, Christy. I need to say
Sorry.
something. Don't know that, Christy.
No, okay, I won't. Okay, don't put
Only
that in there.
the facts.
Okay, don't put that in there.
No, I'm totally putting that in there.
I'm going to get under fire for this one. I can feel it.
We should call it that. Let me write that down. You write that down.
Yeah, now we can stay up late and play games as long as we want.
Except we have a hockey game tomorrow morning.
Oh, that's a lot of generations ahead of or behind him. Ahead of him. No, behind him.
Behind him.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I have so much more to go.
You do?
Yes.